There's a thing nobody tells you about running a diner in a dying town. You learn to read people by how they hold a coffee cup. The white knucklers. The ones who cradle it like it's the last warm thing they'll ever touch. The ones who don't drink it at all, just keep their hands around the heat and stare at the steam like it owes them an answer. I'd been reading cups for 31 years the night old Walt Hargrove backed his truck up to my door on Christmas Eve. I thought I knew every kind of broken a man could be. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. This is the story I've never told straight through, because every time I get to the middle of it my throat does something I can't talk past. But I'm an old woman now, and somebody ought to know what really happened in Coldwater the winter the snow came early, and a lonely man emptied out his whole life onto my counter. Pour yourself something hot. This one takes a while. The first thing I heard was the truck. You don't forget a sound like that. An old diesel coughing against the cold, then idling rough in my back lot at 8:45 on Christmas Eve, when every sane soul in Coldwater was already home with their families, and the only customers I had left were Dale Prout nursing a decaf at the counter, and the radiator clanking like it was trying to tell me something. I'm Marlene, by the way, Marlene Fontaine. The diner's just called the Spoon now, but it used to be Fontaine's after my husband Ray, and before him his daddy. I keep the name short these days because there's less of us left to honor. So, the truck. I wiped my hands on the apron and went to the back door, expecting maybe a stranded trucker wanting to use the phone. What I got instead was Walt Hargrove standing in the snow in a canvas coat 2 sizes too big, his breath fogging, holding a roasting pan with both oven-mitted hands like it was a newborn. Marlene, he nodded at me. Snow was already collecting in the gray stubble on his jaw. Hope you don't mind, I got more in the truck. I want you to understand who Walt was, or who we all thought he was, so you'll know why I just stood there with my mouth half open. Walt Hargrove ran the old Hargrove spread out past the reservoir, 11 miles of nothing on a good road that wasn't a good road. He'd been out there alone for, God, I had to do the math later, 17 years by then. His wife Coraline died of the cancer back when my Ray was still alive, and his boy Daniel had gone off to the service and never come home, not because anything happened to him, but because some sons just keep driving once they get a taste of a way. Walt came into town maybe twice a month. Feed store, hardware, a sack of groceries. He'd say good morning if you said it first. He'd pay in cash, count it out slow. And then he'd be gone, that diesel coughing back toward the reservoir, and you wouldn't think about him again until you saw the truck. He was the kind of lonely that doesn't ask for anything. The kind that makes itself small so it won't be a bother. I'd served him coffee 100 times, and I don't think we'd ever talked about a single thing that mattered. And now here he was with a roasting pan, and when he lifted the foil the smell hit me. Turkey, sage, butter, something brighter underneath, citrus maybe. And it was so good and so unexpected that I actually laughed out loud, this dumb startled bark in the cold. Walt, what in the world? I made too much, he said. That was the whole explanation he offered. I made too much. Like a man accidentally roasts a 20-pound turkey and 4 sides, and a sheet of biscuits for himself out on a ranch where the nearest neighbor is a coyote. I helped him carry it in. That was the part that took a few trips. He had the turkey. He had a pot of mashed potatoes still warm in a towel, green beans with bacon, a cast iron of cornbread dressing, cranberries he'd cooked down himself from a bag he must have bought weeks ago. 2 pies. A pecan and an apple, the apple with the lattice top done careful, the strips woven over and under, and I remember thinking somebody taught him that, and then I remembered who, and my chest went tight. Dale Prout had come around the counter to gawk. Dale's a retired mechanic, 70-some, deaf in one ear and never once in his life at a loss for words. He stared at the spread filling up my counter and said, "Walt, are we having a party?" And Walt, I'll never forget this, Walt looked around my empty diner, the fake garland I'd stapled up over the window, The little plastic tree by the register with 3 ornaments on it because I'm not sentimental and Ray was the one who decorated. The 2 booths with their cracked vinyl, Dale in his Carhartts, me in my apron. And Walt said real quiet, I was hoping somebody'd be here. I think that's the moment, if I'm honest. That's when the floor kind of tilted under me, because I heard what he didn't say. I cooked all of this. I cooked Coraline's whole Christmas dinner, every dish she used to make, and I drove 11 miles through the snow because I could not bear to eat it alone in that house one more time, and I didn't even know if your lights would be on. He'd gambled his whole night on a maybe. Sit down, I told him, and my voice came out rougher than I meant. Dale, get the man a plate. Get everybody a plate. There was nobody to get a plate for but the 3 of us. But I said everybody like there were 40 people coming, because something in me already knew there should be. We ate at the counter, the 3 of us, and at first nobody talked much. Walt had this way of watching us eat, not creepy, just hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food. Hungry to see somebody enjoy what he'd made. When Dale moaned over the dressing and said it beat anything his late wife ever turned out, Walt ducked his head and got busy with his napkin, but I saw the corner of his mouth go, just for a second. I asked him how he learned to cook like this. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the saucer, then another quarter. I've thought about that gesture 1,000 times since, the way his big cracked hands needed something to do while the hard words came. Cora did all of it, he said. Every year I'd be out with the stock and come in and the whole house would smell like this. He gestured at the counter. After she passed, I quit doing Christmas, just another day, easier that way, quarter turn. But this fall I got to thinking I couldn't remember the smell anymore, couldn't call it up, like it was leaving me too. He cleared his throat, found her recipe box up in the closet, took me 3 tries on the pie crust. A pause. Burned the first turkey clean through. Smoke alarm woke half the cattle. Dale laughed and Walt let him, and I didn't laugh because I was watching this man tell me, in the only way he knew how, that he had spent the loneliest autumn of his life teaching himself to make his dead wife's Christmas dinner, just so he wouldn't forget what she smelled like. Walt, I said, this is the best meal I've had in 10 years and I'm not exaggerating to be nice. I don't do that. It's true, Dale put in, she don't. Walt nodded like he was filing it away somewhere. It would have to last him a long time. And here's where it should have ended, maybe. A sad, sweet story about 3 lonely people eating turkey in a diner on Christmas Eve. If that were all it was, I wouldn't still be crying over it. But then the door opened. Cold air and a jingle of the bell, and in came the Ray's family, Ophelia and her 2 kids, the little one bundled so thick he could barely walk. Ophelia worked nights at the care home, and her car had died in my lot 3 weeks running. She usually came in to call her cousin for a ride and warm the kids up while they waited. I'd given up charging her for the hot chocolate. She stopped dead in the doorway when she saw the counter full of food. Oh, she said, I'm sorry, is this private? Before I could answer, Walt was on his feet. 60-some years old, knees gone bad from a lifetime of horses, and he stood up so fast he had to catch the stool. No, ma'am, he said. No, there's plenty, please. There's so much. And he was already pulling out a chair for the little one, fussing with it. This man who I'd have bet money hadn't pulled out a chair for anybody since his wife died. Ophelia looked at me. I looked at her. The older kid, the girl, maybe 8, was staring at the apple pie like it was a UFO. Sit down, honey, I told Ophelia. Tonight nobody pays and nobody eats alone. I didn't plan to say it. It just came out of me, whole, like it had been waiting in there my whole life for the right night. Nobody eats alone. Walt heard it. I watched it land on him, and something in his face came loose that had been clamped down so long the hinges had rusted. I should tell you about the snow, because the snow is the reason for everything that came after. It had been spitting flurries all evening, the kind of pretty Christmas card snow nobody worries about. But somewhere around the time Ophelia's kids were on their second helping of mashed potatoes, it turned. The wind came up off the reservoir and the flakes got fine and mean and started coming sideways, and the radio behind my counter, I keep it on the AM station out of habit, broke in with the county advising no travel, roads closing, a system that had intensified faster than forecast. Coldwater's not a place that handles weather well. We've got one plow and old Merle drives it, and Merle was, at that exact moment, 8 miles away at his daughter's, and the county wasn't sending anybody for a town our size on Christmas Eve. So when the Hendersons' truck slid into the ditch right out front, I heard the crunch. We all did. It wasn't a question of calling a tow. There wasn't one coming, not tonight. The Hendersons came in stamping and cussing and shaking, Bill with a cut on his forehead from the steering wheel and his wife Patty white as the snow itself. And behind them, their grown daughter and her husband and a baby that had started screaming the second the cold hit it. They'd been trying to make it to Patty's sisters in the next county. They weren't making it anywhere now. And then the Kowalskis came in, because they'd seen my lights, and then 2 truckers who'd pulled off the interstate when it closed, big quiet men with frost in their beards, and then the Abbott boys who'd been out being idiots in the storm and had the good sense to be scared by it. By 10 o'clock I had 19 people in a diner built for 30 in summer and never meant to be warm in a blizzard. The radiator was losing the fight. The baby wouldn't stop crying. Patty Henderson was shaking so hard her teeth clicked, and I realized she was going into something, shock or just bone-deep cold, and I didn't have enough blankets. I didn't have enough anything. And through all of it, moving quiet and steady like the eye of the whole thing, was Walt Hargrove. He'd gone out to his truck without a word and come back with a coil of jumper cables and a wool horse blanket that smelled like a barn and was the warmest thing in the building. He wrapped it around Patty Henderson's shoulders himself, careful, like she was something that might spook. He took the screaming baby from the daughter's exhausted arms, took it like he'd done it 1,000 times, which I suppose with calves and foals he basically had, and walked it slow up and down the length of my diner, this huge gentle man with a furious infant against his chest, murmuring something I couldn't hear. The baby stopped crying. I'm not making that up. I don't know what he said or did. The whole room kind of held its breath as that wailing wound down into hiccups and then into nothing, and Walt just kept walking slow, his eyes somewhere far away, and Patty Henderson started to cry into the horse blanket, the quiet kind, the relieved kind. Dale caught my eye across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We were both thinking the same thing. This is the loneliest man in the county. And look at him. Look at what he's been holding all this time with nobody to give it to. The food, it turned out, was enough. Walt had cooked for ghosts, for a wife who couldn't eat it and a son who wouldn't come. And the ghosts didn't show, but 19 freezing strangers did, and there was a plate for every single one of them, and pie besides. I didn't understand yet what that meant. I was too busy keeping people warm and the coffee coming. It wasn't until much later, deep in that long, strange night, when the real thing happened. The thing I still can't get all the way through. I'll tell you in a minute. Let me catch my breath. By midnight the diner had settled into something I can only call a held breath. We'd pushed the tables together. The truckers had hauled in their sleeping bags and given them to the kids without being asked. Somebody'd found the AM station playing carols and turned it low. Bill Henderson's cut had stopped bleeding under one of my dish towels, and he was telling the trucker beside him about a storm in '78 that this one was starting to rival. Ophelia's little boy was asleep across 2 chairs under the horse blanket. The radiator had given up entirely, but 19 bodies in a small room make their own heat, and we'd lit the gas burners on the stove and left the oven cracked open, and we were, against all odds, warm. Walt sat at the end of the counter where he'd started the night. He'd gone quiet again now that everybody was tended to, folded back down into that small, careful shape he wore in public. But it was a different quiet than before. I kept catching him looking around the room, at the kids, at the sleeping baby, at all these people eating his wife's recipes and not knowing it. And his face had this look I didn't have a word for then. I have one now. It was the look of a man who'd thought he was already dead and had just felt his own heartbeat. I brought him a fresh coffee and sat down on the stool beside him, which I never do during a rush, but there wasn't a rush anymore. There was just the long middle of the night and the snow ticking against the glass. "You did this," I told him quietly. "You know that. Half these people would be sitting in cold trucks right now. That baby." "I made too much," he said again. Same words. But this time he almost smiled when he said them, and I understood it was becoming a joke between us, a private one, the first joke Walt Hargrove had made to another human being in I don't know how long. We sat there, the carols played, and then Walt said, not looking at me, turning that cup a quarter turn. "Daniel's pie, the apple, he always wanted the apple, quarter turn. Cora'd make the pecan for the rest of us and a whole apple just for him. He'd eat half of it Christmas Eve and she'd pretend to be mad." His thumb worked at a chip in the saucer. "I made it this year, don't know why. Habit, I guess. The hands remember." I didn't say anything. You learn, running a counter for 30 years, when a person is finally getting to the thing. "Wrote him a letter back in October," Walt said. "First one in a long time. Didn't say anything important, just that I'd found her recipe box, that I was gonna try to make Christmas again." He shook his head slow. "Don't even know if it's a good address anymore. Never heard back, figured I wouldn't." A long breath out through his nose. "Mailed it anyway. Felt good to put it in the box. Like I was still his father even if he wasn't anybody's son." I put my hand over his cracked old hand on the counter. He let me. That was its own kind of miracle, Walt letting himself be touched. "He'd be proud of the pie," I said. Stupid thing to say. The only true thing I had. Walt nodded. His eyes were wet and he was pretending they weren't, and I was letting him. And that's when the headlights swept across the front window. We all looked up. You couldn't help it. Headlights at midnight in a closed-road blizzard meant either somebody else in trouble or somebody crazy enough to be out in it. A vehicle pulled in slow, fighting the drifts, and stopped. The engine cut. A door opened and shut, and a man came up to the glass, snow-caked, hood up, peering in at all of us crammed in the light and the warmth like we were a snow globe somebody'd shaken. He pulled the door open. The bell jingled. Cold poured in. He was maybe 40. Lean, weathered, military straight in the shoulders even under all that snow. He stood in the doorway looking around the room, and his eyes went past all of us, past me, past Dale, and landed on the old man at the end of the counter. I felt Walt go rigid under my hand. The man in the doorway said one word. He said, "Dad." I have tried for years to describe what Walt Hargrove's face did in that moment, and I've never gotten it right. So I'll just tell you the true small things, because the true small things are all I trust. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The coffee cup he'd been turning slipped off the edge of the saucer and didn't break, just rolled, and Dale caught it without looking. Walt stood up. His bad knee buckled and the trucker beside him steadied his elbow, and Walt didn't even notice. He stood there gripping the edge of my counter, with both hands like the floor was the deck of a ship in heavy seas. "Danny," he said. That was all Danny. The whole diner had gone silent, even the baby. 19 strangers, and we all somehow knew not to breathe. Daniel Hargrove crossed the room. He'd gotten the letter. We found out later it had chased him through 2 forwarding addresses and finally caught him in a base in Texas. And he'd read his father's clumsy 3 lines about a recipe box and a try at Christmas, and something in him that he'd been holding shut for 17 years had cracked clean open, and he'd gotten in his truck and driven 19 hours north chasing a smell he remembered from being a boy. He'd hit the storm 60 miles out. Everybody told him to stop. He didn't stop. He'd been driving to the empty ranch. He'd seen the only lit window in Coldwater and pulled in to ask if the road past the reservoir was passable. He didn't know his father was inside. He just needed directions home. The two of them stood a foot apart in the middle of my diner, the sun still snow melting onto my floor, the father shaking, and for a terrible long moment neither of them moved, because 17 years is a canyon and you don't just step across it. Then Walt said, and his voice broke on it, this big quiet man, it just came apart in his mouth, "I made your pie." And Daniel Hargrove made a sound I've only ever heard once in my life, and hope never to hear again, because it would mean somebody's heart was breaking and mending at the exact same time. And he grabbed his father and held on, and Walt's arms came up slow like he didn't trust them, and then fast like he'd never let go again. And the two of them stood there in the steam and the carol music and the smell of sage and apples, while 19 strangers wept openly into their coffee and pretended they weren't. Dale was crying. The truckers were crying. Patty Henderson had her face in the horse blanket. Ophelia had both hands over her mouth. I had given up entirely and let it run down my face and into my collar. I cut that apple pie myself, the lattice he'd woven so careful. I cut the first piece and slid it in front of Daniel, and Walt watched his son take a bite of it, this 39-year-old man eating his dead mother's recipe made by his father's shaking hands. And Daniel chewed and swallowed and said, "It's right, Dad. It's exactly right." And I had to go in the back for a minute. I just had to. They stayed till the plow came. Merle finally got through around 4 in the morning, and by then the storm had blown itself out, and the sky over the reservoir was that hard scrubbed blue you only see after the worst weather, with the stars still out and the snow lying clean over everything like the world had been made new in the night, which I suppose, for some of us, it had. People drifted out as the roads opened. The Hendersons, the Kowalskis, the truckers who shook Walt's hand on the way out, every one of them like he was somebody important, which he was, he just hadn't known it. Ophelia's cousin came for her and the kids, and she hugged me at the door and didn't say anything and didn't need to. Walt and Daniel were the last to go. They'd talked all night low at the end of the counter. I gave them their space and just kept the coffee coming, and I don't know everything they said and it isn't mine to know. But when they got up to leave, Daniel was carrying the empty roasting pan and the cast iron and the recipe box, which Walt had gone out to the truck and gotten because he wanted his son to have it. And they were going home together to the ranch past the reservoir for the first time in 17 years. At the door, Walt turned back to me. Snow in his stubble again, just like the start of the night, but a different man inside the coat. "Marlene," he said, "I don't—" He stopped, turned an invisible cup a quarter turn in the air, his hand not knowing what to do with itself. "I came in here tonight because I couldn't sit in that house with all that food. I thought—" He shook his head. "I just didn't want to eat alone." "I know," I said. "You said nobody eats alone." His voice did the thing again, almost came apart. "I've thought about that all night. I've been eating alone for 17 years, and I thought that was just how it was for a man like me." He looked at his son waiting in the truck, the headlights gold in the blue dawn. "Turns out I just hadn't found the right table." I don't remember what I said back. Something. It didn't matter. He nodded at me and went out into the clean snow and got in the truck beside his boy, and I watched the old diesel cough and catch and pull out onto the plowed road toward home, two heads in the cab where for 17 years there'd been one. I closed up as the sun came over the reservoir. The diner was a wreck, dishes everywhere, the horse blanket somebody'd forgotten draped over a stool, coffee rings on every surface, a child's mitten under a table. I should have been exhausted. I was. But I stood in the middle of all that ruin in the gray Christmas morning light, and I felt something I hadn't felt since before Ray died. I felt like the place had been used for what it was for. Walt Hargrove cooked a feast for ghosts, and the ghosts didn't come. Strangers came instead. A storm came. A baby came that needed walking, and a frozen woman came that needed warming, and a son came 19 hours through a blizzard chasing the smell of his childhood. Walt thought he was making one last sad dinner for a family that was gone. What he was actually doing was setting a table big enough to catch everybody the snow blew in. I've thought a lot in the years since about that thing he said. I just hadn't found the right table. About how a man can be starving for 17 years right next to a town full of people who'd have fed him. If only somebody had thought to say, "Come in. There's plenty. Nobody eats alone." We say it now in Coldwater. It's on a little hand-painted sign over my register. Daniel made it. He's a fair hand with wood, comes by every Christmas Eve to help me cook. Nobody eats alone. We do a supper now every year free, anybody who's got nowhere to be. The whole town turns out. It started with one lonely rancher and a roasting pan and a maybe. Walt passed 4 winters ago, quiet in his sleep at the ranch with his son in the next room. I think that's about the best a person can ask for. I went out for the service and there wasn't space to stand. The whole county came, the truckers kind of came, people who'd only met him that one snowed-in night and never forgot it. Daniel asked me to say something at the front. I'm not a speaker. I got up there and my throat did the thing it does and I couldn't get the words out for a minute. So I just told them what I'm telling you, about a man who couldn't bear to eat alone one more Christmas, about the smell of sage and apples, about a son in a doorway saying, "Dad."